The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com. Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Steve Koczela, president of the Massing Polling Group, here with Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, and it is Thursday, September 18th. Today, we're talking about the recent poll we conducted for Commonwealth Beacon about healthcare in Massachusetts. But first, what is a YIMBYtown? Jen, so you're not in the great state of Massachusetts right now. You're where exactly?
Well, as the very blue and white fabric behind my head that you, Steve, but our listeners, because this is an audio medium, cannot actually see. No, I am not on the island of Nantucket. I am, in fact, in the land of blue and white, aka Yale, aka New Haven, because the YIMBYtown conference, which is the big, huge pro-housing conference that happens every year, is in New Haven, Connecticut this year. And I like talking about housing. So I spent the weekend, and I'm still spending my time listening to people talk about housing. Don't you shake your head at me, Steve Koczela. When I was just a wee baby reporter, I spent an entire day at a conference about three-deckers.
I am so glad that there are people out there like you who take interest in the topics that are very important, but ones that I don't particularly care to spend my weekends on. We are going to talk about YIMBYtown, but we actually have an update on the story that we did last week, the story we covered last week, which was of course all about the Boston mayoral election. Jen, there's an update for the 7 people who listen to this podcast who somehow don't already know what's happened. What is the new development?
The new development is Josh Kraft is on our list, not for anything specific, aside from the fact that he dropped out of the mayoral race on Thursday after we had recorded our podcast. So essentially, as we discussed last week, there was this huge 50-point spread, almost 50-point spread between him and Mayor Michelle Wu. And there was a lot of kind of rumbling after we recorded that, of course, this might be too large a gap for someone to easily close in just a few months, no matter how much money they have. And on Thursday, Josh Kraft said he was dropping out of the main race and he could basically be doing better things with his time and money than spending them on this mayoral race, trying to sort of futilely catch up with Wu. And people looked at the result and looked at this decision and largely went, yeah, probably.
Yeah, that does seem to have been the reaction overall. Just not a lot of surprise, really, not a lot of, oh my gosh, no, just sort of like yep, that seems about right. That seems to have mostly been the reaction. There is one interesting note about this, which is that he was set to be the number 2 on the ballot, or he was one of the 2 people on the ballot. And now there's only one person apparently who would have made it through. So Jen, what actually happens in a case like this? Who actually will be on the ballot with Michelle Wu?
So part of this is up to the certification process through the Secretary of State here, but the idea is that there still need to be some thresholds for making it onto the general election ballot in November. Let's say an incumbent and like a write-in nobody knows ends up running for it. Just because someone gets 5 points in a primary doesn't necessarily mean that they should be on the final ballot in November. So there's a threshold. It's a 3,000 vote threshold. And the third place finisher, Domingos de Rosa, according to the unofficial results so far, is a little bit shy of 2,500 votes. So he doesn't have that 3,000 vote count right now. He wants a recount to be sure about this. So we don't yet know definitively if he will or will not make it onto the ballot. Looks pretty unlikely. But again, all of this comes with the caveat of Michelle Wu got more than 66,000 votes. So I don't think that situation would be one where we brace for an upset. It would more just be, hey, we like elections happening in Massachusetts, so sure.
Yes, it would be another name on the ballot, but not one where we would expect particularly serious competition for the mayor of Boston. Jen, you now are the unofficial mayor of YIMBYtown, and I think we should talk about what that is. There's been an election. It was just me. I'm the only person who voted, and I have now declared that you are the mayor of YIMBYtown. So the first thing you have to do is tell me, what is YIMBYtown?
Steve, there's already a mayor of YIMBYtown. You can't do that.
Wait, there is? Really?
Steve, see, I think so. There's someone wandering around with a sash. I think that means that there's a mayor of YIMBYtown. I'll be honest, I was not here to go suss out the local electoral politics of YIMBYtown, but just in case, just so nobody comes for my head, the thing that I am not mayor of is this conference that is in New Haven, in which a bunch of pro-housing people gather for multiple days to talk about how's it going? How is the yes in my backyard, which is what YIMBY stands for, process actually unfolding across the country? So at a sort of very basic level, the idea of YIMBYism is a direct response to NIMBYism, and that's not in my backyard. So the idea that people might be for the idea of more housing, might be for the idea of more access, but fundamentally don't really want it near them, that's the idea of NIMBYism. And so YIMBYism is basically saying, well, we're in an insane housing crisis right now, and policy focus should be oriented at making sure that as much housing across different housing types is being built as quickly as possible, as smoothly as possible. And so these conferences, this one has more than 1,000 people here in New Haven, basically consists of a lot of panels and a lot of discussions and a lot of meetups around the pro-housing groups to say, you know, how are we actually doing? What states are doing well at building new housing, and what states might be surprisingly lacking?
And at least the conferences I've been to, there's often kind of a general theme or a vibe that people think whatever the thing is you're focused on, you know, whatever the topic is, just where things are on that topic. So is there kind of a consensus about where YIMBY versus NIMBY stands, where YIMBY policy stands? What's kind of the mood or the consensus about where things are?
Yeah, the consensus so far is pretty mixed because housing policy tends to be very state focused. Or, of course, you could be Washington, D.C., not a state, still has a strong YIMBY contingent over there. So the thing that's been interesting is that these wins, as they would characterize them, have not been happening necessarily in the more liberal states alone. You hear very often about Austin's zoning policy, Austin, Texas, where you can basically build an awful lot awfully quickly because they're just not hemmed in by the same zoning regulations as places like Massachusetts. Montana has been doing a good job at building new housing. So you have this kind of contrast between the kind of collective political universe out here in New England discussing why New England is not doing nearly as well as some of these more red states out in the middle of the country. But of course, you also have folks from Colorado, folks from California who are saying essentially that they've notched pretty strong state level legislation wins in recent years that have let them do things like make it easier to build basically anything if a city or town doesn't kind of meet the housing requirements that the state lays out. So there's a bunch of weird wonky little things, but the overall gist of it is that the kind of pro-housing movement is not spread evenly all around the country, and it's not stagnating in quite the places that you might expect it to.
Interesting. And I certainly can attest, I'm sure you can too, that, you know, when you go out to some of these states, just seeing mile after mile of, new housing from the last 5, 10, 15 years it's pretty striking and a pretty strong comparison, I think, with what you see in Massachusetts, where there's, pockets or maybe there's a high rise downtown, but certainly not in the quantities that we would need. Of course, one topic that we have talked about a lot here on this podcast is the MBTA Communities Act, which is one of the big policy attempts to do something about the crazy housing market here in Massachusetts. What has the reception been among YIMBYtown residents to the MBTA Communities Act?
Okay, so this was one of the things that I actually found the most interesting and was one of the reasons that I'm out here in Connecticut, which no, is not a part of Massachusetts. We have not annexed Connecticut, so technically I am out of state, out of mind. But one of the reasons that I'm out here is because there was a lot of very specific discussion about the MBTA Community Act process and what state laws can actually do to impact housing. And the takeaway that was so kind of surprising and striking to me is that there's still consensus that it's a good thing to have. And of course, that's been reflected in polling that we've seen on the MBTA Communities Act, which you folks have done as well. So there's this idea that, yeah, like taking this swing conceptually through sort of a weird process where in an economic development bill, this very stripped down legislation ended up getting passed. And then it was the job of the housing office to roll out these very detailed regulations for how all of these cities and towns who are served by the MBTA are going to comply. But the sense was, oddly, the way that this act was written and structured, which was designed to give cities and towns a good amount of flexibility. So kind of to not make them feel steamrolled over, to not just do sort of a one size fits all, but to say, hey, if you're this close to a T, you can expect to have to rezone for this much, but you can figure out where you want to put it inside this area. You can figure out what kind of density that looks like. Do you want to do a bunch of duplexes? Do you want to do some really big buildings? Do you want to do these cute little street side, like 6-unit buildings that maybe have storefronts in the middle? You can figure out how you want it to zone, but you do have to affirmatively, proactively rezone. So the attempt, in the way that they were describing it at this conference, was to basically say, hey, we're giving you options. And what ended up happening, of course, is that a bunch of cities and towns looked at that, not the majority, I will be clear, but a bunch of cities and towns looked at that and kind of went, I don't know about this, actually. I don't know if we want to do that. And so it kind of spawned these lawsuits and this resistance. And so the sense was essentially that this was a nice idea, but the way that it was rolled out was very complicated in process, very challenging for the groups who were kind of trying to help cities and towns abide by it, and ultimately ended up giving them a lot of leeway to kind of push back forcefully, as contrasted with something like the big housing bond bill that passed last year, which just said, hey guys, guess what? Accessory dwelling units, those like little 1-unit additions that you can see in plenty of backyards around houses, those are just legal as of right now. In any area that has single family housing, those are legal. You can't stop them. There's some restrictions on, their size or what they can look like, but that's it, go ahead. And so the consensus was sort of, the state really kind of was trying to soft roll this major rezoning effort in a way that did end up creating more complications than they expected.
That's really interesting because me, uninformed, me sitting 7,000 miles away would think, this is a bill that creates more housing. These are people who favor more housing. Therefore, support would be uniform for the MBTA Communities Act. But it sounds like there's a lot more complexity behind how people are viewing the issue, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, no, it really, really is. And you did, to be fair, see a mix of people saying, hey, this was a big swing. We kind of need to take those big swings. We're in a really bad housing crunch right now in Massachusetts. The quote, I believe, from the Assistant Attorney General, Eric Haskell, who was on one of these panels and has been litigating the MBTA Communities Act in court, was there's no such thing as a starter home in Massachusetts anymore. And the entire process of trying to convince cities and towns to sort of get on board with the state plan ended up kind of being chasing them around individually or sending a lot of letters out or being very engaged on kind of the technical support side. So there is a real question, not in YIMBYtown, about whether we need new housing, because the state says we need 220,000 units of housing in the next decade to basically meet demand here, but whether or not the kind of New England governance traditions like town meeting, which was described by someone as once a year everyone walks into a gym and decides on everything, is necessarily the best way to kind of facilitate this sort of very complex regional housing discussion.
Yeah, very interesting, and certainly learn something new every day. So Jennifer Smith, housing reporter here for us at the horse race, and sometimes also, from what I gather, for Commonwealth Beacon. Thanks, as always, for making the long journey here to this podcast.
I am absolutely delighted. There's going to be some more thorough write-ups about everybody pulling their hair out at YIMBYtown at ye old Commonwealth Beacon. And that brings us to our main segment this week, healthcare. So here at Commonwealth Beacon, we are halfway through this month that we're doing that's focused on healthcare access. So if you want to check in on some of our reporting on access deserts, Medicaid cut impacts, and more, just go wander over there. There's a lot of good stuff. But today we get to dig into the base for my latest story, which is an absolutely sprawling healthcare poll that MPG conducted for us. We're going to talk about it. I talked to a bunch of health officials about it and how it squares with their experience. But Steve, it's polling, so we get to tee you up. Who exactly was polled? When were they polled? How were they polled? What do I need to know?
Yes, exactly. No, this was a poll that was done in mid-August of 1,000 Massachusetts residents. This, like many of our surveys, was conducted online, and it included a range of topics. Some of them we talked about last week. We talked about the approval numbers and so forth for a few officials. But then, as you noted, the vast majority of the poll had to do with healthcare on a whole range of topics. And I am now going to ask you about what the poll found, because
I love
the world
it.
is upside down, and that feels like the right thing to do. And also because you wrote, about 8 gazillion words on this. So, Jen, top level, let's start off with how people think Massachusetts is doing compared to other states.
Yes, so at a very high level, and this is probably not going to be shocking to you, people overall say that Massachusetts has some of the best healthcare in the country. 42% of respondents said it was one of the top states, and then another 27% said it was above average. 2% say we're one of the worst states. I am not positive where they would get that impression, because polling and surveys consistently over and over and over again do note Massachusetts healthcare is stupid expensive, but it is really, really good. We've got a lot of world-class institutions here, a lot of really great physicians. So in terms of quality, people largely agree that it's pretty good. And that is especially true of people with advanced degrees or bachelors, or who make a lot of money here. They're way more likely than people at the lower income levels to say that we are especially good rather than just pretty good.
Yeah, and that actually echoes a theme that we've seen in other polls, even other Commonwealth Beacon polls, where Massachusetts is rated highly on a series of items, whether it's education, higher ed, healthcare, and so forth. But then when you break that out by socioeconomic status, then you see this divide emerge, where the follow-up question is, Massachusetts is great for whom exactly? And, that's, I think, something that the charts on the story, which everyone should definitely go check out, really show. We're doing great on quality, definitely one of the tops, but then when you're looking at affordability, many more people would say kind of middle of the pack or below. What did you see in that affordability chart?
Now, this was one of the first things that kind of made me blink a little bit, actually, when I saw the results of the poll, which is that when asking how does Massachusetts rank in terms of affordability, so comparing it to other states, and that's what's one of the things that's really interesting about this poll, is you asked people how they feel about their own insurance and their own coverage, but also it is trying to get at that question of, what is Massachusetts doing right or poorly in people's minds. And I was really interested because you've got like this really clean bell curve, basically, of how people feel we rank according to other states in terms of affordability, where just 13% of respondents said that we were one of the top states in terms of affordability. 10% said we were one of the worst states in terms of affordability. The majority were basically either split between above average or below average, but 30% said we're middle of the pack when it comes to affordability, which is just not actually true. So that was a very interesting result to me, because as we were sort of trying to piece it apart, the question is, well, how are people at actually figuring out how their individual care compares to other states? Or are people just assuming, hey, healthcare is really expensive everywhere and we have good healthcare in Massachusetts, so it's probably about as expensive? So what do you make of that kind of poll where there is a bit of a break from reality?
Yeah, I think that's, fortunately or unfortunately very common is that people don't actually really know the facts on a lot of issues. This one particularly I think is interesting, but you could imagine, if you haven't moved for 10 or 15 years or 20 years and haven't lived anywhere else, like this is what this is the experience that you have. And if you don't spend all your time on healthcare policy like we do, then, it may not be as familiar of a topic for you. You also think like people are filtering this through what they pay for insurance. That's kind of another thing. It's not like the total cost that, the hospital and the doctors are getting from my healthcare. It's like, how much do I actually pay out of pocket? So, but certainly it is very common that people just, they don't know. They don't know the facts, but, the political situation deals with how people perceive things in many cases. And, that's kind of what I think this chart brings.
That's right. And I think just to put kind of a button on a point that I've made here loosely is residents also said they were really generally pretty happy with their individual insurance levels too. As we know, Massachusetts is a very, very insured state. I think it's only something like between 4 or 2% across the entire state that doesn't have some form of insurance. Most of them, of course, employer insurance there. But so you asked people how they felt about their health insurance. How satisfied are they with their specific coverage? And again, you saw 76% are either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied with their individual insurance. And also a similar number were pretty happy with the selection of primary care doctors near them. And the reason that I say this is that we are careening into the thing that kind of made me scratch my head, blink, turn in a circle, burrow into the ground when I was looking at these poll results, which is even as residents are by and large saying that they're really happy about their healthcare coverage, they're also reporting behavior that doesn't, to me, kind of square with that. So a third of residents said they'd skipped or delayed seeking care due to cost in the last year. And of respondents who are also basically in charge of somebody else's healthcare, a quarter of those said they've had to skip or delay seeking care for a dependent due to cost reasons. And then you also saw about a third of respondents saying they've had claims rejected from insurance companies. A fifth of the residents say they've had to wait more than 2 months for a primary care appointment. So you're seeing these kinds of behavior reports, people saying, yes, it's expensive, it's hard for me to get to care, all of that is true, and yet I'm still quite happy with the coverage in Massachusetts. And so that to me was kind of the core of this poll, that people are kind of struggling at a larger level than you might automatically think in Massachusetts due to cost and access. And yet at the same time, the favorability basically of our healthcare system is still squaring with this idea that we're one of the best states to have healthcare in. So that was a lot. So I really kind of just want to get your temperature on that, because that was what really stood out to me.
Yeah, I think you really hit on the central tension of Massachusetts healthcare as a whole. If you need a super complicated, rare procedure that only 4 doctors in the entire world can do, odds are pretty decent that 1 or more of them are in Boston. You'll have great care taken of you. You'll get all the things. But if you need to see somebody kind of mid-level, or you just want a primary care appointment, you could wait. You could see your claim denied. It could cost you a lot of money, and so forth and so on. So certainly, yes, like that is, I think, the question that a lot of policymakers and advocates are asking themselves is like, what exactly is the system good for, and what do we want it to be good for? Like, how do we keep that super high quality care that you can get at MGH and Beth Israel and some of these places, while also being sure that somebody who just needs their infant seen for an ear infection, isn't kind of jumping through this many hoops, or like, the child has a broken leg or needs some kind of scan or something like that. Like, that's where you can just end up in these high expense situations or claims denials or just waiting. And, that certainly is the challenge.
And this also careens into one of our favorite meta things to do here on the horse race, which is talk about it's not just what you see, but also what you're measuring. Because when you look at these kind of national rankings of it, you might see something like from the Commonwealth Fund, which has no affiliation with Commonwealth Magazine, everything's just called Commonwealth, where they're looking at access essentially to care, and they rank Massachusetts one of the top states when it comes to access and affordability. And one of the metrics that they use is adults in Massachusetts who went without care in the last year or lacked a usual source of care, whereas the Health Policy Commission here in Massachusetts and the Massing Polling Group poll were asking, did you skip or delay care for cost reasons? So it's not just did you never get the thing treated, but was access, was cost leading you to put that off? And the reason that that's interesting is because one of the things that Massachusetts is not as good at is dealing with kind of preventable health outcomes. Essentially, if you can't get in to see your PCP for a weird thing that you've noticed on your body, or you think that you've just tweaked your ankle or something, you don't get that checked out, then you might not get it treated until later in an emergency room setting when you suddenly realize that it was more serious. I can have a very direct anecdote from my family here, which is that when one of my younger brothers was in high school, he was playing soccer and he got kicked in the shin, and he thought it was literally just a bruise. And they were saying, walk it off, do your thing. You're a good, strong boy. Don't worry about it. But in fact, there was a break, a fracture on his leg. And so he was walking around on a leg with a very serious injury on it. And so the kind of delay in getting that sort of initial check-in leads to it being a slower recovery process later. So there's parallels for that in kind of the entire healthcare system, which is if you say there's some reason I'm not going to go get this checked out, you might just end up in the emergency room later, which is associated with worse health outcomes, and it's more expensive overall for you and for the state. So that's kind of the context there.
Yeah, I certainly can relate to that, experience trying to get various health appointments for my three kids. I do want to ask about the experts that you interviewed, because you're a reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, a great reporter, even before you were at Commonwealth Beacon. And of course, you didn't just look at the numbers and transcribe them. You went and asked people, what do these numbers mean? What do they say to you? So I
put that in the
up.
script, the compliment Jennifer section.
I have launched the slingshot. You're soaring, Jen. What did you find there?
Yeah, so because this sort of result was so confusing to me, I did go and I talked to health experts, and I also talked to kind of health finance experts about what I should be making of this. And they basically all said, yeah, this kind of squares. We use insurance rates. We use sort of the broader quality of our healthcare system as a proxy for talking about how well any individual person is being treated. Basically, the idea of, hey, if you've got insurance and we've got these great hospitals, you're probably better off than most people in most states. But the reality of how expensive it is here and how kind of slow the process can be for kind of trying to address these inflationary cost issues means that the experience for a lot of people here in Massachusetts is making these decisions about what is the best use of their time, what is the best use of their money, what is the best use of all of their resources. And if it doesn't seem extremely serious now, you can see people delaying care. But one of the other things they pointed out very consistently is this is about to get a lot worse on the cost side, because we are going to be seeing in the next few years impacts from the big Trump tax bill that included changes to the way that Medicaid eligibility is calculated out and how states can expect funding assistance from the federal government for dealing with these very low income communities and people. And so if, of course, the state's healthcare programs end up with more of a funding shortfall, that now means, what do? You're cutting additional services. People won't have access to even what they have now. And so you just see these sorts of effects end up snowballing more. So that's kind of why everybody is trying to do an all hands on deck approach right now, as much as any state can, to try and figure out, if we already know it's bad, if this predates the Trump administration, how do you essentially identify the things that are most important to shore up now so that you can basically say when the full effects are hit, it's not basically taking everybody out?
Yeah, it reminds me too of the episode that we did with Katie Lannon, where we just talked about the potential impending doom that the state budget could face. So definitely go back and have a listen to that if you want to know, what could happen if all of the basically the worst of the worst happens to our Medicaid budget, and what that would do to the state budget as a whole. And if you want much more on this poll, go to commonwealthbeacon.org. There's so much. Jen wrote it all. We made the charts. Just great data all around.
Look at that. Incredible. Yeah. And one of the things that I'm excited to get into in the future, so a little bit of a teaser, is there's really fun stuff in here about telehealth. So in case you forgot there was a pandemic, there is some fun data in here. That's our tease. Go over to our website. Go read the website. Go look at some polls.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the Massing Polling Group. The Massing Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massingpolling.com.
And that brings us to our final segment, which this week is brought to you by the horse races not considering running department, which tracks when politicians are not considering running. Jen, we have a new entry. Our crack reporting team has been out there covering who's not considering running. Who is on the list this week?
Our crack reporting team is politely reading Playbook Massachusetts because I have been covering the housing people, while Kelly Garrity over there at Politico Playbook has been wandering around Springfield monitoring all of the mass Dems chaos, hair pulling, enjoyable fights over the party platform that everybody definitely pays a lot of attention to. So what she reported is Rep. Seth Moulton is apparently keeping the door to running statewide open. When asked if he was considering running for statewide office, Kelly says he said, "I'm not thinking about it." So, Steve, in political parlance, what is that? Is that I always have to think about some other office? Or is that I refuse to close off any doors? Or is that I am definitely doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that anytime you say anything other than no, definitely not. Like Charlie Baker has said that about running for governor next year. He could change his mind, but for now, there's no door open at all. There's no light through the door. There's nothing. But, Seth Moulton for a while has had his eye on various other things, furthering his political career as politicians do. And, there's big races coming up next year, not least of which are Governor and Senator Ed Markey, of course, is also up for re-election. So, and then, of course, all the state constitutional offices also. So Seth Moulton is currently not thinking about it, which I had to diagram out, but that means that he is thinking about it.
Well, we are not still going to be podcasting indefinitely this episode because that is all the time we have for today. I am Jennifer Smith signing off with Steve Cazella. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cazella. You can write to us at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's Daily Download and reach out to the Massing Polling Group if you need any polls or focus groups done. Thank you all for listening. We will not see you next week.